Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii on the 7th of December 1941 involved not only Japanese aircraft but also submarines. 9 large fleet submarines were operating around the Hawaiian Islands during the aerial attack, including launching 2-man midget submarines that penetrated the Pearl Harbor defenses some hours before the carrier airstrikes began. Following the success of Pearl Harbor, Japanese Naval Command ordered the large submarines to make for the U.S. West Coast. The Japanese knew that the American public and military were nervous and jittery following the attack. Japanese submarines hunting close inshore off the California and Oregon coasts would further undermine American morale. A fear of some sort of Japanese landing on the West Coast was also widely believed by Americans at the time. Before we get into that, a quick word from our sponsor. Call of War World War II is a free online strategy game that gathers millions of players worldwide. You fight up to 100 other players in real time in games that can take weeks to complete. The games feature World War II historically accurate maps and units that allows you to create your own path and rewrite history. Call of War World War II is fully cross-platformed. Your objective is to take over the world. Define your own strategy, build powerful armies by combining dozens of different unit types, and fight for world domination. Mark Felton Productions viewers are getting a special gift. Click on the link below to get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. The offer is available for only 30 days, so click the link in the description, choose a country, and fight your way to victory in epic real-time battles. 8 Japanese submarines hunted through to the end of December 1941. The Imperial Navy's 6th Fleet at Kwajalein had conceived a 2-part plan for these submarines. Vice Admiral Shimizu had ordered the submarines to interdict American merchant shipping, and then to expend remaining deck gun ammunition against shore targets on the mainland of America. The submarines I-17, 19, 21 and 23 had all launched deck gun and torpedo attacks against American coastal merchantmen with hardly any successes. They sank 2 American tankers and damaged 6 more, all within sight of land, causing consternation out of all proportion to their successes. But interestingly, none of the Japanese had carried out shore bombardment as ordered. At the end of the year, the submarines returned to Japanese bases to refuel and rearm, and some were sent on other missions to Australia and New Zealand, but a handful returned to lie off the California coast. One of these vessels, the I-17, did determine to carry out the second part of the original orders and bombard the American coast, even though the Japanese Navy's Chief of Staff, Admiral Nagano, cancelled the order he had issued to submarines as he feared retaliatory attacks on Japanese installations and towns. But it seems that Lieutenant Commander Nishino in the I-17 appears to have ignored his orders and to have proceeded with the original instructions to strike the shore. Question is, why? The story of Nishino's attack on the Barnstable Oil Company's Elwood refinery, located 10 miles north of Santa Barbara, California, appears rooted simply in a desire for personal revenge. During the late 1930s, Commander Nishino was a merchant seaman, captain of a Japanese oil tanker that had arrived at the Elwood refinery's mile-long row of derricks for unloading. Oil company executives invited Nishino and his crew to a welcoming ceremony north of the beach. As Nishino and his men made their way along a path from the beach, the proud Japanese sea captain had slipped and landed on top of a prickly pear cactus. Delighted American oil workers could not control themselves at the sight of Captain Nishino having cactus spines extracted from his backside, and Nishino's humiliation and loss of face was complete. It must also be remembered that in February 1942, Japan stood at the high watermark of her conquests. British Malaya had fallen, and the great naval base of Singapore had surrendered to the Japanese on the 15th of February, and 100,000 British, Australian and Indian troops had fallen into Japanese hands. In Burma, the British were in retreat, conducting a fighting withdrawal through 1,000 miles of hills and jungle. The 17th Indian Division was by February in serious danger of being cut off at the Sitang River, the British exit into the relative safety of India. The war was also going badly for the United States. General Douglas MacArthur's forces were bottled up in the Bataan Peninsula on the island of Luzon in the Philippines, and MacArthur himself had just been ordered to abandon his doomed command by no less than President Franklin Roosevelt himself and flee ignominiously to Australia. The American island of Wake had been in Japanese hands for 2 months. The Japanese were poised to launch an invasion of Java in the Netherlands East Indies, one of the final frontiers of Allied resistance in the south before Australia. Perhaps personal reasons drove Nishino to disregard Admiral Nagano's orders and shell the American coast, and perhaps his decision was made in a moment of national euphoria as the expanding Japanese empire appeared unstoppable. They had a term for it. It was called victory disease. By February 1942, Nishino had returned to the area of his humiliation several years before, but this time commanding a well-armed and powerful submarine. On the evening of the 23rd of February, as the light disappeared from the sky, the Japanese submarine motored on the surface towards the giant refinery, its dozens of derricks fronting huge aviation fuel storage tanks situated on a hill behind the beach. Nishino stood on the conning tower bridge, scanning the place he hated more than perhaps any other with binoculars, the deck gunners having already loaded their weapon with a 140mm shell. At exactly 7:15 p.m., Nishino ordered the gunners to commence firing. The first reports of the gun, which echoed across the mile or so of sea separating the submarine from the land, brought local residents and oil workers to their windows. Many workers rushed out of a popular local drinking hole where they were relaxing after a hard day of labor. Confusion reigned after the impact of the first shell as people attempted to locate the source of the explosion. As the deck gun banged out for a second time, oil workers spotted the Japanese submarine sitting on the surface out at sea opposite the refinery. Workman G.O. Brown commenting afterwards that it was so big, I thought it might be a destroyer or a cruiser. Within minutes, the local police were informed of an enemy submarine boldly sitting on the surface, firing at the oil refinery. The local sheriff assured the callers that American aircraft were on their way to deal with the intruder. However, the American authorities would be unable to do very much about it, a fact not lost on Commander Nishino. Anywhere between 16 and 24 shells were fired by the I-17. Accounts vary. 11 were counted falling into the sea, while at least 3 struck and damaged rigging, pumping equipment at an oil head. Other shells passed over the refinery to land on ranches up to 3 miles from the coast. Nishino certainly came close to starting a major conflagration, as one shell exploded in a field only 30 yards from one of the giant aviation storage tanks. Suddenly, Nishino abruptly ordered the gunners to cease firing at 7:35 p.m., and the I-17 departed the scene on the surface, moving along the Santa Barbara Channel for the open sea. At the small town of Montecito, 16 miles east of Elwood, the Reverend Arthur Basham noticed the submarine heading south towards Los Angeles and flashing lights as if it were attempting to signal with the shore. The submarine was still reported to be motoring on the surface at 8:30 p.m. by local residents, and Basham's report to local police fueled suspicions that Japanese Americans had been in communication with Nishino's boat and aided his locating targets. Reports of flashing lights out to sea off Santa Barbara led to the imposition of a blackout until just after midnight, as local authorities feared further bombardments against shore communities. Nishino's attack, though perhaps only serving as one man's lust for revenge, cannot be entirely dismissed as a freak event. The huge Elwood oil refinery was an important military and economic target, and had Nishino succeeded in setting fire to the aviation fuel stored there, he would have scored a significant victory. Commander Nishino made history by becoming the first person to successfully attack the mainland of the United States since the War of 1812. But more important by far was the fear and panic Nishino's audacious plans sparked off along the American west coast. Many believed the United States was about to be invaded, coming so soon on the back of the successful Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor only 3 months before. What occurred in Los Angeles just days after the Elwood refinery attack demonstrated to everyone that invasion fears were widespread, and all that was required was a spark to ignite the entire coastal region. Following the I-17's successful deck gun bombardment of the Elwood oil refinery on the 23rd of February, US forces defending the west coast were placed on high alert. Another scenario, apart from invasion, faced by the US authorities was a Japanese air raid on one or more of the large West Coast metropolises, such as Seattle, San Francisco, LA, and San Diego. It was not beyond the realms of possibility that a Japanese carrier force could repeat the kind of mass aerial attack witnessed at Pearl Harbor, this time attempting to disrupt civilian life instead of destroying a military target. Not forgetting that all of these cities had a sizable US Navy presence. Nishino's attack further undermined relations between white and Japanese Americans, which had already been severely eroded following the Pearl Harbor raid. In LA, anti-aircraft guns and searchlights were standing ready to take on the Japanese. An alert system was operational, with 10,000 air raid wardens ready to take to the streets. And Army radar units carefully monitored their green scopes for a Japanese presence in the skies above the City of Angels. At 2:25 a.m. on the 25th of February, as most residents of LA slept soundly in their beds, an eerie sound grew across the city, heralding imminent danger. Hundreds of air raid sirens wailed through the still night air, triggered by the spark necessary to light the invasion fear touch paper, a radar contact recorded at slightly before 2 a.m. The blip on the radar screen was formally identified at 2:07 a.m. as an unidentified aircraft approaching the coast. Officers at 4th Interceptor Command, tasked with defending LA from aerial attack, immediately posted a yellow alert. For 15 minutes, the unknown contact was tracked, still approaching LA, and as the aircraft did not deviate from its course, the alert status was upgraded to blue. A blue alert signified to military, civil defense, and police authorities that the aircraft was presumed to be hostile. Following just 3 minutes later was the order to go to the red alert status. As far as the authorities were now concerned, an enemy air raid was imminent. Across the city, the mournful blaring of air raid sirens continued to awake residents. Searchlight beams stabbed out into the night sky. The city was blacked out, and anti-aircraft batteries reported themselves manned and ready to 4th Interceptor Command headquarters. Thousands of air raid wardens and police officers took to the streets to assist the military. By 2:32, all anti-aircraft batteries and searchlight units had completed reporting their status. The anti-aircraft weapons employed by 4th Interceptor Command were 37mm cannon and larger 3-inch guns. The combined number of guns within LA could place 48 flak shells into the sky every minute, creating a perilous curtain of fire for any would-be bombers to penetrate. At 3:16 a.m., all anti-aircraft guns suddenly commenced firing, hundreds of shells exploding like some crazed fireworks display high above the city. So the guns ceased firing at 3:36. Searchlights continued to trace bright patterns across the sky when suddenly at 4:05 the flak guns recommenced firing. At 4:15, silence once more returned to the city as the batteries ceased their blind hammering of the empty sky. 30 minutes of sustained anti-aircraft fire had hurled approximately 1,440 rounds of both 37mm and 3-inch ammunition into the air above Los Angeles, equating to a massive 10 tons of ordnance. Most of the shells had exploded at their preset altitudes. Some had not. Either way, 10 tons of expended shrapnel and unexploded shells now fell back onto the city below. Some of the larger 3-inch shells that had failed to explode in mid-air detonated instead when they began impacting all over LA. Houses and garages were damaged as white-hot shards of shrapnel ripped through homes, often narrowly missing terrified residents. As the sun came up later that morning, Army bomb disposal teams were at work all over the city, roping off streets from curious bystanders before making safe American 3-inch shells that had buried themselves in roads and gardens without exploding. Incredibly, only 9 citizens of LA had died during the air raid, most from heart attacks or accidents in the blackout. At the North American Aviation Factory complex located at Inglewood, brand new B-25 Mitchell bombers were discovered with wings peppered by falling shrapnel. More serious was the metaphorical fallout of the air raid in the treatment of California's Japanese-American community. Several days prior to the Phantom raid on LA, President Roosevelt had issued Executive Order 9066. This law required the enforced internment of all Japanese Americans for the duration of the conflict in, quote, concentration camps, unquote, outside the city. During the night of the air raid, police, who believed them to have been signaling to enemy aircraft with lights, arbitrarily arrested dozens of Japanese Americans. Most of these people were only guilty of driving a car during a blackout or other minor infractions of the law. Questions began almost as soon as the last flak shell exploded. Did the Japanese attack LA on the 25th of February 1942? The answer is an emphatic no. Reporters arrived at a ludicrous figure of 50 enemy aircraft over the city during the air raid. The American military provided some face-saving evidence with which to prove that an attack had indeed taken place. For example, the 122nd Coast Artillery Regiment, guarding an aircraft factory at Downey, identified several aircraft flying beyond the maximum range of their guns, but fired at them anyway. At Long Beach, Battery G, 78th Coast Artillery Regiment, protecting the Douglas Aircraft Factory, logged 25 to 30 enemy bombers, followed half an hour later by another 15, all flying in formation. This battery fired 246 3-inch shells into the sky, claiming the mystery bombers then moved out to sea. Officially, at least, the Japanese did launch an attack on LA, according to the US Army, after receiving several reports from anti-aircraft batteries. The Army settled on a tentative estimate of 15 enemy aircraft over the city between 2:30 and 4:30 a.m. This raises an obvious question. 15 aircraft could only have come from a Japanese aircraft carrier, and a detailed search undertaken the next day failed to demonstrate a Japanese naval presence in inshore West Coast waters, submarines not included. In the light of this news, the authorities changed their story, stating that the 15 aircraft reported were most probably of civilian origin and had been, conveniently, piloted by enemy agents. On the 26th of February, the Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, completely undermined the Army statements when he declared that the air raid on LA had been a false alarm. The US Army continued to defend its original assertion for some time, eventually requiring congressional intervention, perhaps unwilling to accept the embarrassment of having been firing at Phantoms rather than Japanese bombers on the night of the 25th of February. No evidence has ever been produced to prove that the Japanese did raid LA. No bomb damage was recorded anywhere in the city, no planes were downed by anti-aircraft fire, and no one has ever come forward to say that they participated in the raid, Japanese pilot or enemy agent. So what were the gunners actually firing at? False radar returns was one possibility. Weather balloons was another. Some had been released nearby, and one air raid warden even described a balloon being hit and bursting into flames. Another suggestion has been a large alien spacecraft. The UFO story originated with a doctored photo of something caught in searchlight beams over LA that night. If it was aliens, we should commend their forbearance in not vaporizing La La Land after such a welcome. Japanese submarines were very real, however, and all Americans living in California and Oregon knew that the enemy was close. What the Phantom LA air raid perhaps demonstrated above all else was the fears of invasion and attack Americans were living with in early 1942, and the competence of the civil defense and anti-aircraft units whose job was to protect the city. They did their job on the night of the 25th of February and stood ready to protect the city from any future Japanese attack. Commander Nishino and the I-17 remained at their assigned patrol area after the attack on the Elwood oil refinery. The 28th of February, 5 days after the shore bombardment, and 3 following the Phantom Japanese air raid on LA, Nishino struck again. Lookouts located the tanker William A. Berg, and Nishino shot a single torpedo at the American ship. Fortunately for the merchant seaman, the Japanese torpedo detonated prematurely, but Nishino believed that he had struck the tanker. The William A. Berg escaped damaged and made off from the scene of her close brush with disaster. The invasion scare was over for the time being, but the Japanese would return to the west coast in summer 1942 to shell shore targets and even launch an aerial assault. 11th of May 1942. 2 long-range Japanese submarines, the I-25 and I-26, departed Yokosuka, Japan for the west coast of North America. In part 1 of this series, we saw how the Japanese submarine I-17 had launched an audacious deck gun bombardment of the Elwood oil refinery in California on the 23rd of February 1942, and helped to trigger the infamous Los Angeles air raid 2 days later. Now, 2 more Japanese submarines were coming to directly attack the North American mainland. The I-25 was equipped with an onboard reconnaissance aircraft, the Yokosuka E-14Y1 floatplane codenamed the Glen by the Allies. Carried with wings folded up inside a waterproof hangar forward of the conning tower and launched by a catapult mounted on deck. The aircraft was retrieved by landing in the sea beside the submarine and being hauled aboard by a crane. The I-26's hangar was empty. They initially played a role in the Japanese attack on Midway, specifically the diversionary attack on Dutch Harbor, Alaska, designed to draw American aircraft carriers and other warships away from Midway. On the 27th of May, the I-25's floatplane, piloted by Chief Warrant Officer Nobuo Fujita, conducted a successful reconnaissance flight over Kodiak Island, spotting an American cruiser and 2 destroyers. After the successful recovery of Fujita, the I-26's hangar had been kept empty just in case the I-25 had been unable to recover the floatplane. The I-25 sailed on down the west coast of America, arriving off the coast of Oregon on the 14th of June. While off the Oregon coast, the I-25 launched a series of false submarine periscopes constructed of painted bamboo, which were mounted on special submerged rafts, designed to confuse local American anti-submarine forces that were conducting regular patrols along the coast. On the 18th of June, Lieutenant Commander Tagami, commanding officer of the I-25, received new instructions from Rear Admiral Yamazaki, ordering him to attack American military targets along the west coast by shelling them with his deck gun. The I-26 received the same instructions at the same time and went on to attack the Estevan Point Lighthouse in Canada on the evening of the 20th of June. Vancouver Island forms part of the huge Canadian province of British Columbia, lying in the Pacific Northwest. The shoreline is dotted with numerous lighthouses that have for generations guided the local fishing fleets, as well as trans-Pacific telegraph stations vital to late 19th through to mid-20th century international communications. Estevan Point Lighthouse was constructed in 1909 and is one of the oldest Euro-Canadian structures in the region, standing in 1942 close to a local Indian settlement. It was a relatively remote area little affected by the Pacific War, but all that was rudely shattered in the late evening of the 20th of June 1942 by the Japanese submarine I-26. Commander Minoru Yokota surfaced his boat approximately 2 miles out at sea, directly off the lighthouse, and ordered his gunners to pump shells at the building in the hope of toppling the structure. Yokota's shelling of the lighthouse at Estevan Point has come under historical scrutiny in Canada, and the lighthouse attack has become a controversial issue. According to the Canadian government, the I-26 fired between 20 and 30 140mm rounds from her deck gun at the lighthouse, but caused almost no damage before leaving the area after an hour sitting on the surface offshore. There are those who doubt whether the attack was the work of the Japanese, and these conspiracy theorists have suggested that the shells actually originated from an American ship or submarine, and intentionally failed to cause any material damage. The harmless attack was made, according to the revisionists, in an effort to bolster Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King's Liberal government that found itself in the midst of a controversial move to implement conscription in Canada. Historians writing in Canada's foremost history magazine, The Beaver, suggest, quote, "The timing of the submarine attack seems like a stroke of phenomenal luck for King, the Liberal Party, and possibly even the continued unity of Canada. Or was the timing a little too perfect?" Unquote. The authors note that the debate on the controversial conscription bill was at that moment raging in Parliament in Ottawa. Quote, "Perhaps a discreet enemy incident of the manufactured sort was just the thing needed to galvanize Canadian public opinion towards the kind of all-out effort needed to justify overseas conscription." Unquote. According to post-war statements made by Commander Yokota, skipper of the I-26, his chief gunner took aim on the lighthouse at a range of 2 miles and commenced firing at 10:15 p.m. on the 20th of June. Although approximately 20 to 30 shells, accounts vary, were fired at the very prominent and tall target, not a single round struck either the lighthouse or the nearby Indian settlement. This incredibly poor gunnery has provided conspiracy theorists with evidence for an American firing the shots instead, and deliberately missing the human habitation and important navigational beacon while posing as an enemy intruder. Commander Yokota explained that the appalling marksmanship of his gunners was because of the dark. "Our gun crew had difficulty in making the shots effective," he wrote. The revisionist historians who challenge the very presence of the I-26 point out that even at the time of the attack, 10:15 p.m. on a late June evening at such a latitude, it would still have been light enough to read a newspaper. They also suggest that Yokota was, quote, "honor-bound to corroborate any official statement made by the newly established authorities, the victorious Allies," unquote. There are certainly some inconsistencies that have allowed doubts as to the veracity of the attack to creep into the frame. The lighthouse keeper, Robert Lally, made a note in his log during the attack of 2 warships firing on Estevan Point from 2 different directions. In all later government reports, the warships were reduced to 1 submarine. The official report submitted by the senior Canadian naval officer in the Pacific to the government in Ottawa in July 1942 stated that the bombardment, quote, "was in all probability carried out by 1 submarine mounting 5.5-inch guns forward of the sub's conning tower," unquote. However, Japanese I-class submarines such as the I-26 were fitted with a single 140mm or 5.5-inch gun mounted behind the conning tower. American submarines, on the other hand, matched the Canadian officer's description of the offending vessel perfectly, and American boats were the only other submarines operating in that region at that time. On the 3rd of July 1973, an unexploded Japanese Navy 140mm shell was discovered close to Estevan Point. This physical hard evidence of the Japanese attack goes some way to disproving some sort of elaborate subterfuge being played out on the Canadians by the United States in order to solidify Canada's resolve regarding a full commitment to the war in Europe. The debate over the Estevan Point attack may rumble on for many years to come, with the truth remaining elusive. Yokota went to his grave adamant that he had indeed shelled Canadian soil and performed the mission he had been assigned. The very same night that the I-26 shelled Estevan Point, the I-25 torpedoed the British freighter Fort Camosun, 70 miles south-southeast of Cape Flattery. The sinking wasn't straightforward, as a distress call brought 2 Royal Canadian Navy corvettes to the scene. The I-25 slunk away, but then it turned up at the mouth of the Columbia River. Japanese naval intelligence had informed the I-25 skipper that there was a US Navy submarine base located at the port of Astoria, close to the river mouth. However, lying between the I-25 and her intended target was the huge Fort Stevens. Work had begun on constructing Fort Stevens in 1863, the middle of the American Civil War. Something needed to be done to protect the entrance to the Columbia, and the result was the construction of 3 forts named Stevens, Columbia, and Canby. Although not to see any action during the Civil War, Fort Stevens nevertheless provided a formidable obstacle for any seaborne raider attempting to penetrate the Columbia River. Time passed, and the weapons at the 3 forts were progressively upgraded and modernized. The defenses were never tested for real until Commander Tagami and the I-25 hove into view the night of the 21st of June 1942. Fort Stevens was fitted with many types and calibers of artillery, all of it dating from the turn of the century. There were 6-inch and 8-inch guns, and 12-inch mortars. One of the most novel weapons mounted on the fort were 10-inch rifles, a particularly impressive gun. Each time the weapon was fired, the barrel would recoil backwards to an automatic locking point, which meant that the weapon actually disappeared inside its embrasure, allowing the crew to reload the rifle out of sight of the enemy. Not surprisingly, this weapon was nicknamed the Disappearing Rifle. Fort Stevens contained enough firepower to stand off a Japanese fleet, let alone a single puny submarine armed with nothing more impressive than a 140mm deck gun. Protecting the mouth of the Columbia was a ring of electrically controlled mines anchored below the water's surface at selected depths. A total of 156 mines were arranged into 12 groups of 13, each group linked to a control room in the fort by cables. A final deterrent to a potential enemy was Sperry searchlights mounted on the fort. Each searchlight was enormously powerful, able to illuminate a ship at a maximum range of 6 to 8 miles, doubly important to the fort because it lacked radar. Sunday the 21st of June was the longest day of the year. The air was warm as the I-25 slowly and discreetly trailed fishing boats heading into the approaches to the Columbia River in the darkness. A myriad of lights twinkled and glittered from the shore, indicating to the Japanese officers on the conning tower the town of either Astoria or Seaside. The wind was a mere 4 knots, which meant that the sea was calm, and therefore Warrant Officer Sensuke Tao, the boat's chief gunner, should not have encountered undue difficulties hitting his target. Indeed, down on the deck, Tao was overseeing his gunners as they prepared the weapon for action, the barrel pointing up at 30 to 40 degrees, all ready to begin pumping rounds onto the American shore. As the I-25 silently drifted across the entrance to the Columbia River, approximately 20,000 yards offshore, the troops manning the batteries expected another quiet and uneventful watch. Commander Tagami gave the order to commence firing. As the first Japanese shells began exploding around Fort Stevens, all hell broke loose. Soon the night air, already rent by the whistle and loud bangs of the incoming Japanese shells, was further disturbed by the mournful wail of the siren as troops rushed to man their positions and prepare to return fire. Fort Stevens, however, was destined not to fire a single shot in reply to the I-25's bold attack. The senior duty officer at the Group Fire Control Station in charge of ordering the batteries to fire, Captain Robert Houston, refused to give the order. As far as Houston could tell, there were three problems that prevented him from unleashing the fort's considerable firepower at the Japanese interloper. Firstly, from the distant muzzle flash of the Japanese deck gun, Houston estimated that the enemy vessel was approximately 20,000 yards from the fort. Although the 10-inch rifles mounted on the fort were much more potent weapons than the puny Japanese gun, the antiquated nature of the fort's armament meant that the rifles could only shoot a maximum of 16,200 yards. Secondly, the enemy vessel appeared to be moving and firing, and Houston lacked radar with which to accurately control his fall of shot onto the target, assuming the enemy vessel came within range. Thirdly, and perhaps rather ignominiously, Houston believed that if he ordered the batteries to open fire, the Japanese would easily pinpoint the muzzle flashes from the big 10-inch rifles and begin a form of counter-battery fire on the fort's main armament. As the rifles were out of range, the Japanese gunners could have hit the American gunners with impunity. In the meantime, confused American gunners stood by their weapons, wondering when on earth their officers would issue the order to open fire. Morale began to plummet among the ordinary American soldiers as Japanese shells continued to impact around the fort. The lack of an American response to the Japanese shells was not helpful to the I-25's gunners. Although there were lights ashore, the Japanese had little idea of what they were actually shooting at and simply poured shells in the general direction of Fort Stevens. The I-25 fired 17 shells, causing only superficial damage ashore, before quietly departing the area and heading for Yokosuka in Japan. However, the Japanese were not quite finished with the American West Coast just yet. The I-25's pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Fujita, had submitted a plan to launch a daring aerial attack on the US West Coast. Chief Warrant Officer Fujita approached Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo with an interesting plan. Use the small two-man Yokosuka E-14Y-1 floatplane carried aboard some Japanese submarines to launch air raids on US targets. The plan was approved and Fujita decided against attacking a US city. The E-14Y-1's bomb capacity was very small, and any damage he inflicted would be negligible. Instead, Fujita recognized that the huge forests of the Pacific Northwest were very vulnerable to fire. Fires that, if big enough, would hurt the US logging industry, threaten settlements, and US lives. The mission was given its go-ahead, and the submarine I-25 was assigned to carry it out, which surfaced west of the California-Oregon border about 6 a.m. on the 9th of September 1942. Fujita took off with his observer in his Yokosuka floatplane, carrying two 77-kilogram incendiary bombs under the wings, and flew inland, dropping one on Mount Emily in Oregon and a second in an unknown location. A small fire was started on Wheeler Ridge on Mount Emily, some 10 miles east of the town of Brookings in Oregon, but it was extinguished by Forest Service personnel. The Japanese plane was heard or briefly glimpsed by several lookouts manning towers in the Siskiyou National Forest, and it was the first penetration of continental U.S. airspace by a real enemy aircraft in World War II. Fragments of the Mount Emily bomb were given to the U.S. Army for analysis, confirming the origin of the attack as being Japanese. After Fujita's aircraft was recovered from the sea by the I-25, the submarine was attacked by a pair of U.S. aircraft, escaping though sustaining some minor damage. 3 weeks later, on the 29th of September 1942, Fujita tried again. Using the Cape Blanco light as a navigational beacon, he flew 90 minutes east, dropped his incendiaries, and returned safely to the submarine. Fujita said that he saw flames on the ground, but no fires were reported by Forest Service personnel. The rain-saturated forests were difficult to burn, frustrating Fujita's efforts. So ended Japanese aircraft attacks on the continental US. The attacks I've covered thus far in this film all figure in my book, The Fujita Plan, published in 2006. At the time, I and everyone else missed an attack on a US icon. The Japanese attack on the Golden Gate Bridge. I first came across this story in a newspaper archive, dated 1946. In June 1946, the people of San Francisco read in the newspaper that a live Japanese World War II torpedo had been found half buried in a sandbank in a beach close to the Golden Gate Bridge. It was at the time, and even today, a complete mystery as to how it got there. But I think I can answer that question based on my previous research into Japanese submarines off the west coast in 1941 to 42. The torpedo appears to be physical evidence of a previously unrecorded Japanese attack on a US city, a daring attempt to destroy a landmark that evidently went awry. On the 5th of June 1946, a man walking on Marshall's Beach, close to the Golden Gate Bridge, spotted something in the surf. Recognizing it as a torpedo, he called the police, who in turn alerted the US Navy. The torpedo was partially buried in a sandbank. It was soon identified as a World War II Japanese long-lance torpedo, one of the best weapons of the war. The Type 93 Long Lance entered service aboard Imperial Japanese Navy submarines, cruisers, and destroyers in 1933. The Japanese called it the oxygen torpedo due to its propulsion system, which used highly compressed oxygen as the fuel oxidizer in the weapon's propulsion system. The Type 93 had a range of 44,000 yards, or 40 kilometers, hammering along at 38 knots, or 70 kilometers an hour. The 29-foot-long, or 9-meter-long torpedo weighed 6,000 pounds, or 2.7 tons, with an explosive warhead of 1,080 pounds, or 490 kilos. In June 1946, Ensign R.E. McBride and a U.S. Navy demolition squad arrived on Marshall's Beach to deal with the Long Lance. As a precaution, all land and water traffic was stopped below and over the Golden Gate Bridge. Dealing with the weapon took place the following day under difficult conditions in the surf. The torpedo's warhead was still live, and McBride estimated that the weapon had been embedded in the sandbank for at least 2 or 3 years and maybe more. The sailors cut the warhead off the torpedo and hauled it out of the surf. The main body of the Long Lance was also hauled onto the beach using ropes and pulleys. A demolition charge was fixed to the warhead and detonated. Though the explosion was quite weak, as the warhead was very corroded after sitting in the ocean for years. It's believed that the rest of the torpedo was taken away by the Navy and scrapped. So, who fired the torpedo and when? This wasn't addressed in 1946, and has not been until now, for my research has pinpointed which Japanese submarine was responsible and the date when the attack took place. On the 10th of December 1941, 3 days after the surprise Japanese air and midget submarine attacks on Pearl Harbor, a Japanese submarine reported that the aircraft carrier USS Lexington and 2 cruisers were heading northeast from Hawaii. The Japanese failure to destroy the US aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor had been a very grave error, and the Imperial Japanese Navy was determined to locate and sink them as soon as possible. Vice Admiral Shinjuku ordered all available Japanese submarines to locate and sink the Lexington. The large fleet submarines I-15, 9, 17, 19, 21, 23 and 25 set off at flank speed. By the 14th of December, they had failed to find the Lexington. The submarines were joined by the I-10 and I-26, and the 9 Japanese vessels received orders to go to the US West Coast and sink merchant shipping close inshore. These vessels lurked close to Los Angeles, Seattle, the mouth of the Columbia River, Cape Blanco in Oregon, Cape Mendocino, Monterey Bay, and Estero Bay in California, and San Diego. But the one we are interested in was the I-15, allotted a patrol area of San Francisco, west of the Farallon Islands. Her skipper was the experienced 50-year-old Commander Nobuo Ishikawa, the I-15 being a large submarine in comparison to German U-boats of the time. Completed in 1940, she was a B-1 type submarine, 3,654 tons submerged, 357 feet or 108 meters long, with a massive range of 14,000 nautical miles or 26,000 kilometers. She had a crew of 94 and even had an aircraft carried in a watertight deck hangar and launched using a catapult and retrieved using a crane, the Yokosuka E-14Y seaplane used for reconnaissance. Regarding armament, the I-15 had 6 torpedo tubes and carried 17 long-lance torpedoes, and also had a 140mm deck gun. On the 14th of December 1941, Imperial Headquarters in Tokyo ordered a supplementary mission for the 9 Japanese submarines lurking off the US west coast. On the night of the 25th of December, Christmas Day, the submarines were to surface a mile or two offshore and proceed to bombard targets with 30 rounds each from their deck guns. The propaganda value of such a symbolic assault on Christmas Day, the enemy's special holiday, would be immense. Ishikawa and the other Japanese sub-skippers were all keen to carry out this operation against the hated enemy homeland. On the 17th of December, the I-15 surfaced near the Farallon Islands in order to recharge her batteries and air the boat. The crew were allowed up to the conning tower bridge in groups to view the lights of San Francisco through the optics in the distance. The citizens of the city evidently unaware of the danger lurking in the dark waters offshore. The I-15 continued to linger off San Francisco for several more days, but no merchant ships were intercepted. Then, on the 22nd of December, came disappointing news. The shore bombardment operation set for Christmas Day was postponed by express order of the commander of the combined fleet, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, to the 27th of December. Why? The Japanese feared offending their German and Italian allies by launching an attack on Christmas Day, the holy Christian festival. But the delays scuppered the plan. By the 27th of December, most of the submarines were reporting that they were running low on fuel and must return to Kwajalein in the Marshall Islands at once. In Tokyo, the bombardment plan was abandoned. The Navy was evidently worried that American submarines would do exactly what the Japanese were doing and shell coastal settlements in Japan in retaliation. Reluctantly, the submarines began to turn for home, leaving the west coast. But clearly Commander Ishikawa decided to strike at San Francisco before departing, as the long lance found in 1946 could only have come from his submarine, as no other Japanese submarines operated off San Francisco during the war. Clearly he ordered an attack on the city using torpedoes, instead of his deck gun, so as not to violate his orders. A torpedo hitting a target ashore would have been reported by Ishikawa as a miss while firing at an enemy merchant ship, which was the purpose of his submarine being positioned off San Francisco in the first place. But what to target with a submarine? Why not the Golden Gate Bridge, the very symbol of San Francisco? The Art Deco masterpiece had first opened to traffic in 1937. Then it was the world's longest suspension bridge at 4,200 feet or nearly 3 kilometers, and the tallest at 746 feet or 227 meters. It connects San Francisco to Marin County. It was difficult to build. The channel is deep at over 370 feet and prone to violent winds and thick fogs. The 2 weak points for the suspension bridge are its supporting towers. If substantial damage could be caused to either the north or south tower, the bridge could be structurally compromised, though how much damage a long lance could realistically cause to the massive structure remains doubtful. Ishikawa must have fired some way off. The torpedo aimed at the bridge's south tower, but the long lance went further south by a few hundred yards and instead impacted the soft sand of Marshall's Beach, where it lay undisturbed until 1946. However, it seems unlikely that an experienced sub-driver like Commander Ishikawa would have bet everything on one shot from some distance. It seems more likely that in order to increase his chances of hitting a bridge tower, he would have fired a spread of 2 or 3 torpedoes, as he would have done against a single merchant ship or indeed a convoy. Though the bridge tower was of course a static target, the action of the sea could cause a single torpedo to run wide, especially if fired from a great distance. This is only speculation on my part, but I wouldn't be surprised if another 1 or 2 long lancers are buried in beaches adjacent to Marshall's, or even within San Francisco Bay itself, yet to be found. Certainly, asking Commander Ishikawa or any of his officers to confirm what really occurred on the 27th of December 1941 has been impossible since the war, because the I-15 was sunk with all hands on the 10th of November 1942 by a US minesweeper off the British Solomon Islands. So the Marshall's Beach Japanese torpedo remains an intriguing mystery, and one that perhaps may yield up further clues in the future. But that's what I love about World War II. There are still so many mysteries just waiting to be explained. So, with the failure of the Japanese shore bombardments and incendiary attacks of 1941-42, Japan tried one last time to hit the continental US using this time an unmanned weapon: the balloon. Paper has long been used for many structures in Japan. It proved to be cheap and durable material for making a weapon. Once again, the Japanese required the initial utilization of their submarine force to attack the US, and in 1943, 200 balloons were prepared to be launched from 2 modified subs, the I-34 and I-35. Each balloon had a 20-foot envelope and a range of more than 600 miles. Although the operation was fully prepared by August 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy realized that employing submarines on such missions would not have been a suitable use of their potential, especially as the war had long since begun to deteriorate for Japan. The project was shelved, but the Imperial Japanese Army continued development instead. The Army lacked the means to launch balloons from a midpoint between Japan and the US, so the new weapons had to be designed to depart from the Japanese home islands. The Army balloon bomb project was codenamed Fugo, or Windship Weapon. The Army designers of the 9th Military Technical Research Institute under Major General Tsuyoshi Kosaba, in cooperation with scientists of the Central Meteorological Observatory in Tokyo, produced a balloon design designated the Type A. The balloon was made of 64 laminated mulberry paper tree gauze, these sections forming the curved surface of the balloon. This was glued together with a form of potato paste, forming a balloon envelope with a 100-foot circumference. The envelope was then filled with 19,000 cubic feet of hydrogen to provide the necessary high ceiling the weapon required. Below the envelope was suspended a woven dural ring with bombs and 36 ballast sandbags attached, controlled by 3 aneroid barometers and a small battery mounted on a platform above, which controlled a circuit to maintain altitude and release the bombs. The balloon's gondola could be loaded with high-explosive anti-personnel or incendiary bombs. Japan called the new weapon Fusen Bakudan, or fire bombs. Launch sites were located on the east coast of the island of Honshu. Once released, the balloons were uncontrollable and reached North America at the behest of the wind currents, cruising in the jet stream at between 20 and 40,000 feet. To maintain altitude, ballast bags of sand were automatically released if the balloon began to sink. In the daytime, the balloon would cruise at maximum altitude, but at night the envelope would collect dew and would sink as it became heavier. The altimeter would cause a set of blow plugs to fire, releasing some ballast and restoring altitude. When all the sand was jettisoned, the bombs would become the final ballast, they being released automatically, an event timed to occur somewhere over North America. Finally, a picric acid block would explode, destroying the balloon gondola, with a fuse being lit that was connected to a charge on the balloon itself. The resultant mixture of hydrogen, air, and explosives would cause the balloon envelope to burn up as a large orange fireball. The first balloon launched on the 3rd of November 1944 with a United States Navy patrol boat discovering a balloon floating in the sea 67 miles off San Pedro, California on the 5th of November. The first known successful attack on the US occurred on the 6th of December 1944, bombs being dropped around 12 miles southwest of Owl Creek Mountain, close to Thermopolis in Wyoming. Fragments of balloon envelopes and gondolas were discovered in Alaska and Montana, and forensic tests confirmed the wreckage to be of Japanese origin. The American people were not told of the attacks, and the media was ordered not to report this alarming development. The US was also developing countermeasures to deal with this unique threat, codenamed Operation Firefly. The US 4th Air Force gathered fighter aircraft to shoot down the balloons before they could release their payloads, and many were downed over the Aleutian Islands before they could reach their targets as they sank to lower altitudes. One was shot down over Oregon. There were fears among the United States authorities that the Japanese might launch balloons fitted with chemical or biological weapons to land on US soil. And to counter this threat, stocks of decontamination chemicals were quietly distributed to the western states, and farmers asked to report any strange crop markings or animal infections that occurred. Although the authorities played down the potential damage the balloon bombs could wreak, a U.S. Army unit, the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion, nicknamed the Triple Nickel, was trained to act as fire jumpers should the incendiary bombs set the forests ablaze. Of 9,300 balloon bombs launched from Japan, only 212 were confirmed as having reached the United States and Mexico, landing as far east in the U.S. as Michigan, and a further 73 were confirmed as coming down in Canada. The only fatalities caused by balloon bombs occurred on the 5th of May 1945 on Gearhart Mountain near Bly, Oregon. A picnic party of 1 adult and 5 children were killed instantly when they dragged an unexploded Japanese Navy 15-kilogram anti-personnel bomb out of the woods, the only known fatalities caused by enemy action on the mainland US during the war. It is not known if any of the balloons started forest fires. In April 1945, the Japanese ceased their balloon launches, largely because the US media blackout gave them no information whatsoever about the success or failure of their campaign. What remains certain, however, is the fact that many of the bombs remained unaccounted for, and after nearly 80 years of deterioration could pose a serious risk to anybody who discovered one of these lethal relics in the US countryside today. The balloon bombs were certainly spread widely over the North American continent. For example, one struck a power line in Washington state, cutting off electricity to the Hanford Engineer Works, where the US was manufacturing plutonium for the top-secret Manhattan atomic bomb project. 45 bombs landed in Oregon, 37 in Alaska, 28 in Washington state, and 25 in California. 7 landed in Nebraska, including Omaha. Another landed 10 miles from Detroit, and another near Grand Rapids. The bombs have continued to turn up long after the end of World War II. In November 1953, a Japanese bomb was discovered by the Canadian Army at Edmonton, Alberta, while the US Air Force found another in Alaska in 1955. In southwest Oregon in 1978, yet another Japanese bomb was found and destroyed. In Canada in 2014, the remains of a balloon gondola, including still live ordnance, was discovered near the town of Lumbee. A live bomb, dramatically embedded in the earth, was deemed too dangerous to move and was blown up on site by bomb disposal experts. Don't forget that Mark Felton production viewers are getting a special gift from Call of War World War II. Click on the link below to receive 13,000 gold and 1 month premium subscription for free. Choose a country and fight your way to victory. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share, and also visit my audiobook channel, War Stories with Mark Felton. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon. Details in the description box below.